Okay. First of all, I just want to acknowledge and thank the Sanemuk people whose traditional territory we're on. And when First Nations introduce themselves, they give their lineage and they talk about what village they're from. So in keeping with that, I should mention right off the bat that Lorne is Kathy Tuominen, who is my sister, and I's brother. So he's the son of Dodie and Gary Hammond, who kept their weekend home, summer home on Protection Island, and that I live in now. He's also been a consultant to the Protection Island Museum, so he's very connected with Protection Island. Since 1996, he's been the curator of history at the Royal BC Museum, as was our neighbor Bob Turner at one point. He was also the curator of the Royal BC Museum's exhibit Gold Rush, El Dorado in BC, which has traveled all over the province. And I understand, I think it also went overseas, maybe to China. So he knows a lot about the gold rush. So how he got to where he is, he went to UVic and he got a BA with distinction in history. But I do want to point out he dropped out at some point and he went and he worked on the green chain at UBO, which inspired him to go back to university and finish his education. He got his MA in history on the Hudson's Bay fur trade, and he did a lot of statistical analysis on all the coast animals that were collected prior to 1850 in the province. And you can ask him anything, like at one point I had to ask him how many wolf pelts were collected in 18 whatever it was, and he said 16, 4 here, 2 there, and 10 here. He's amazing for facts. And he did his PhD in the lumber trade in Ottawa Valley. As to his accomplishments, he's quite reticent to talk about his accomplishments. And he did this morning at the last minute send me his 32-page CV, and I was very amazed at all that he has done. His first accomplishment was being the firstborn in the family, and that theme comes up again and again. He was one of the first Canadians to get the American Fulbright Scholarship. He was one of the first people to teach environmental history and he did that at Carleton and at UVic, where he is still an adjunct professor. He organized a couple of the first environmental history conferences in Canada, and they were international conferences. And all this history background, I found, gives him an insight to the future. In terms of writing, he did a classic article on the fur trade with the title something along the lines of Marketing Wildlife. He co-edited the Biographical Dictionary of American and Canadian Naturalists and Environmentalists. I like to call it the Book of Dead Environmentalists. And he wrote the 12 entries for the Canadian environmentalists. He also co-wrote a book, Stewards of the People's Forest, a book on the BC Forest Service, and he recently co-edited and wrote a chapter in this the Royal BC's book on orca whales, and that's a beautiful book, and it was done for the orca exhibit, which was supposed to start last year, anyway, in the time of COVID, and it's now open so people can go visit it if they want. He also did numerous chapters in the Oxford Companion to Canadian History. And a few little tidbits I wanted to throw in. His basement is filled with synthesizers, and he consults, fixes synthesizers, and does valuations of synthesizers for musicians. One of the neat things I think he did was John Lennon had the Rolls Royce, you know, all painted with beautiful designs on it, and Phantom 8, a Rolls Royce Phantom 8. And when Rolls Royce a few years ago, Phantom 6, 5, 4, whatever it was, but a few years ago, they came out with the Phantom 8, and they wanted to have one Phantom from each one car from each Phantom model on display in London. So Lorne actually took the Rolls-Royce to London and had it on display there and got to hang out with all the Rolls-Royce chauffeurs and aficionados and etc. And so that was quite a highlight for him, I think. And he's done dozens of short TV clips on historical BC tidbits. So if you get Czech TV, you might have seen him on TV quite a bit. And he's a great dinner party conversationalist. The conversation will never lag if Lorne's at the table. So I'd like to turn you over to my brother, Lorne.
Thank you, Liz. One small correction. The conferences were at the University of Ottawa. There's two, not Carleton. I know all the Ottawa people will be going, oh, not Carleton. Oh, there's nothing wrong with Carleton. They have an excellent department. But yeah. Okay, so what you see behind me is a photo recently taken of the Gold Rush Gallery on the 3rd floor of the Royal BC Museum. And in 2015, a team of us, and everything we do is a team effort. My colleagues Zui Chung and Catherine Bridge and external experts like Dan Marshall assisted us, and numerous Indigenous people were interviewed and contributed their voices into the exhibit. We did an exhibit on the Gold Rush in BC. We haven't changed the gallery behind me at this moment, but there's lots of changes going on in the Royal BC Museum. And if you're really curious about it, there's been lots of information, but the latest is a letter from the Minister of Heritage, which is in today's Times Colonist on the editorial page. And that sort of gives you the flavor of what's actually going on. And right now, when I go back to work on Monday, I will be finishing taking down the first exhibit I ever built, and then the next exhibit I built, and so forth. But what we're really doing is taking everything off the floor, cataloging it, making sure the information is up to date, and we've got good color images to put up on the web, because a lot of things went out on exhibit before the existence of computers or digital photography or any of that. And we're carefully tracking everything so everything can be available to reshape the galleries and tell a new and improved story of the diversity of British Columbia. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now and get started. I've got about 28 slides, and here, I think we're, and give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen. Good, okay. So this is really not so much about the exhibit that we did in 2015, and then in 2017, it traveled to Ottawa and it was on display in the Canadian History Museum for about 6 or 8 months as their major exhibit. Then it came back and some of it went back in the galleries and lots of it went into storage. But we learned a great deal about it. And a lot of what we learned doing that exhibit hasn't made its way yet into the storylines. And so that's what I'm going to try and talk about a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Page down. Ah, okay. And I'm just going to. So the first thing I want to say is I'm broadcasting to you from my home on Lekwungen territory, which I am a guest of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. And as we sat down as a committee of 6, I think, to talk about what would be in a new gold exhibit, this image emerged as the iconic image that stuck with all of us. So the question is, whose gold and whose land? So I'll back up a little bit before I explain the image. When the Hudson's Bay Company was based in Oregon on the Columbia River in territories that hadn't been negotiated yet and hadn't been subject to treaties, they were aware that there was gold on the West Coast, but they were pretty quiet about it. It would come in traded and they would accept it for goods. but it usually went very quietly into a trunk in the headquarters building. And they didn't really talk about gold very much because they knew that gold would draw immigrants into the territory. And what they wanted was their relationship with indigenous people and the trade in furs, which left the Columbia River and went down to Tierra del Fuego and around that and all the way up to London, to the fur auctions in London, which fed the furriers in Paris and Germany and other places. So they knew that gold was a dangerous mineral, not just because of its value, but because of the draw it has on people's imaginations. I could get rich. So gold was something that wasn't talked about very much in the fur trade. It kept it pretty, that's a card they kept pretty close to their chest, literally in a chest. When the negotiations set the new boundary, the 49th parallel, that chest made its way up to Fort Victoria with the committee, which included Governor Douglas, the first fur trade committee before he became a governor of the colony. There were 3 people running things, and they were quite aware of it. And then gold started to trickle in from the rivers of British Columbia, often found at the bottom of falls. In BC, we have a lot of valleys that are shaped like this, and gold and water runs down the bottom of the V, steeply down through the mountains into the Fraser and down to the mouth of the river. And it's been said gold has been found on every stream and creek on Vancouver Island, maybe in very, very small amounts, but it started to come in. And the first gold, the first significant gold, was found at the junction of the Thompson River and the Fraser. And that's where this photo was taken. And this photo is a First Nation family with a rocker chest that's on the far left, and shoveling gravel in, washing it with water, and then the ridges in that box will hold the heavier minerals, which are the nuggets of gold, while the lighter things like sand and sort of are washed out. A lot of things like gold pans are held upside down over fires to blacken them so that the gold stands out even more and is easier to spot. So the question of whose gold, under colonialism and colonial law, gold is retained by the crown. And the extension of colonialism over the indigenous people of British Columbia meant that the government maintained that it owned the gold. That was disputed right from the first by the indigenous people along the Thompson. It was their gold. And whose land? Their land. The story of the gold rush, what came out very strongly for us when we did the exhibit, based on the historic evidence, written and accounts, and in many cases accounts which were from the United States that shed a little more light than what we'd had from just the BC archives, started to bring a really complex picture of the moment of the gold rush, which really sort of gets triggered in 1858 with the arrival of that chest I mentioned, shipped down to San Francisco to the mint, the US Mint, for it to be assayed for value and smelted into transportable forms. And the word of the chest that arrived under a Hudson's Bay Company seal got out really quickly. And those words were also fanned by editors in San Francisco who, from a political perspective, didn't really like the border stopping at 49 and would love to see annexation. So the movement of large numbers of people north had a political dimension as well as a wealth and greed dimension. And this had a tremendous impact on indigenous people. At the time of the gold rush in 1858, what is now Washington State, these were seen as unorganized territories from a US government perspective, was heavily engaged in a really vicious war against indigenous people. And there were pitched battles between indigenous people and the US cavalry. There were settlers who were setting up scatter guns and firing randomly at canoes of peaceable people going to their fishing spots and so forth. There was a lot of violence and driven by race. There were accusations from the American side of the border that the Hudson's Bay Company along the border didn't ask any questions when indigenous people from south of the border came up and traded horses with brands from the US cavalry and traded them for large kegs of gunpowder and lead shot and then went south. So there was a lot of rumors and speculations, some may be true, some may not be true, but there was a lot of ill will. As the miners started to arrive, and the traditional interpretation is 30,000 miners descend coming up from San Francisco, one of the things people aren't aware of is that lots of them did not come by ship to Victoria or attempt to go up the Fraser River by ship. Large parties came overland, and one group of 500 kind of vigilante miners who are determined to fight their way through indigenous territory in Washington state came up overland into the Okanagan. And I'll say a little more about what happened next after that. And what happened with, well, what happened with that group as they crossed the border, they ran into an unarmed, peaceful party of 30 Okanagan First Nations who had their canoes by the lake, and they opened fire on them and they killed them all. And so as that group of armed people forced their way up the Okanagan trying to get to the Fraser River and find the source of the gold that was washing down, other groups equally armed were trying to force their way up the Fraser River. And what hasn't been in BC history books up until this exhibit really is the story of the Fraser Canyon War. It's always been a Canadian belief that Canada was far more peaceful than the United States, and we didn't have the sort of things that happened down there, you know, the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Trail of Tears and all of this. And it's simply not true. There were not thousands killed, but there was probably over 100 people killed in the Okanagan and up the Fraser Canyon. And the miners as vigilantes formed armed groups around their leaders, and many of the groups had come up specifically from different parts of the United States. And so the traditional view was James Douglas arrives with the Royal Engineers in red tunics and the Union Jack and creates peace by basically bluffing much larger numbers of armed people to accept the role of the crown and law and the way it will organize the gold fields and make sure that their permits and everything are protected and organize safe transportation of gold to the south. But in actual fact, Douglas is only responsible for half of ending the Canyon War. The other half was, and the most significant half, was by Chief David Spintlin. And he was one of a number of chiefs at Lytton, in the Lytton area, and he called a meeting of all of the First Nations to the north of the Okanagan and along the canyon. And they had a 3-day meeting to discuss what to do. Should it be an all-out war to force the people off the canyon and out of the Okanagan? Or would they negotiate a peace? And it was Chief Spintlin who talked to a lot of younger Indigenous people who wanted a full-on war into negotiations. And Chief Spintlin and Governor Douglas together managed to calm things down and end what really was a shooting war that at least 100 people had died in. So the photo here comes from the Lytton archives. And it is a photo of everyone gathering in 1927 to put up a memorial to Chief David Spintlin. And if you're up in that area, the bridge is named for him and the community center was named for him. And so Chief Spintlin is one of the great untold BC stories. And we hadn't heard of it before we began the project, but people in the Lytton area knew all about it. So the other thing I want to talk about are how some of the, oops, sorry, I will go back one there. How history changes and collections don't necessarily change. I mean, you may add new things to museum collections, but sometimes what I find interesting as a professional in a museum, the meaning of an object changes. So on the left, this is Mrs. A.E.W. Patterson of Saskatoon. She's presenting a silver tray once given by the government to BC pioneer Chartres Brew to provincial archivist John Bovey. So Brew was a Crimean War veteran. He came to BC with the gold rush, was a member of the Legislative Council. And when he died, his tea service in the 1880s was auctioned off. And a member of the family could only afford the tea service because taking silver back into England meant you faced all sorts of taxes. And so they only bid on the tray here in Victoria and took it back to England. And eventually, when this happened in about 1980, came and presented that tray to the provincial archivist. Now, what the tray says, and I should have the quote here, but I don't. The tray says something thanking Chartres Brew for putting down the Chilcotin Indian insurrection. And I'll say a little more about that. And so thank you very much for the hanging of the chiefs from the Chilcotin. And here's a silver tray service because we would like to thank you for your actions in taking one of the two expeditions up into Chilcotin territory, which resulted in the man on the right, Justice Matthew Bailey Begbie, presiding over a trial in Quesnel. The First Nation chiefs came in under a white flag of parley and were seized. And that included chiefs who went with them to discuss how to end a very violent war that had taken place to defend Chilcotin territory from a gold rush trail or road being pushed through the high plateau because it would shorten the time to Barkerville in the gold fields. And the chiefs and the person who led the defense and his son were pleaded guilty, but so too the court found the negotiators also as participants. And so there was a mass hanging in a field in Chilcotin under a death sentence placed by Matthew Bailey Begbie below. And another person was hung about a year later down in New Westminster who was part of that group. For the Chilcotin people, the wounds from what happened in what they saw as a diplomacy to bring peace are still there today. Here's an example of a story that I learned along the way. An RCMP officer pulled over a pickup truck in the Chilcotin and walked up to them and asked, license and registration for whatever it was, speeding or a tail light or something. It wasn't anything particularly serious. It was just highway duty. And the driver said, "Oh, yeah, you're the people who hung our chief." And he didn't know what they were talking about. And so he had to go and ask around the community. And it turned out everyone told their children the story, generation after generation. It was not forgotten. That happened at the time of the gold rush. And I like to say, well, you think history doesn't matter? Well, it does. And these are the Chilcotin chiefs meeting with the minister after the House has formally apologized for the execution of the Chilcotin chiefs. This came as a result of a Supreme Court case that recognized that title was never extinguished in the Chilcotin, and that the Chilcotin demanded an apology and full control over mineral and logging and control of their land, arguing that, hey, we fought to protect our land and there is no treaty. So this was one of the things that I learned doing this. And right after the apology, I was aware of the tray that we had. And I thought, you know, the tray has suddenly changed meaning completely. As a thank you for suppressing an Indian insurrection from the legislature, this tray now represents an injustice. And I'd also known that His Honor Stephen Point, who was our First Nation Lieutenant Governor, had been presented by the staff that's on the right, by the Chilcotin. And they gave him this carved staff, which has the faces of all the chiefs who were executed, and they presented it to him and asked him to display it in the hall of Government House until justice was done. And with the apology, I suddenly realized people are attempting justice. So as a curator, I contacted His Honor, I contacted the current Lieutenant Governor, who then said, well, it was presented to His Honor Stephen Point, and I'll have to take his guidance on it and ask him. And so through that, permission came for us to borrow the Chilcotin staff and put it together with the tray and the story. Below that, from our archives, is the writ of execution with the black wax at the bottom, and some artwork from the Wagon Road's coastal entry. So that for me was an important act of reconciliation by me, because once that had been done, I could make the story really visible. That was not planned to go in the exhibit. And it was a last minute pleading with the designer. Do you have space for one more case? I'm gonna try and make this happen. So that's a bit of what I learned as a curator when you start digging and researching and working with objects. What else did we learn about BC gold rushes? Other than 30,000 people came, and it was the framework of the government, and it created settlement and wealth and merchants, and most government budgets were drawn out of import duties. Land didn't generate very much revenue. It's certainly not like Victoria today. But one thing that really came home was you shouldn't talk about the gold rush as a BC story just on its own. Gold rushes are global events. What we have here is out of an old book in the BC archives, and it's the giving out of licenses by the government. You can see the uniforms in the middle of the crowd, and somebody's doing scales and weighing gold dust and things like that. But the trick about this is these miners are not in British Columbia. They're in the gold fields of Australia about 1851. And one of the things the colonial government of BC learned from the 1851 Australian gold rush is that things can get out of hand really easy. Armed miners who feel like they've been hard done by claim jumping or having been robbed as their gold came down from the gold fields to the small towns that existed, were a pretty unruly bunch. And there were battles between regiments of troops and regiments of angry miners in the Australian gold fields. And California gold fields were not peaceful. And there were frictions in New Zealand and Venezuela with the gold fields. And after our gold events, there were many other gold events here, but there was also gold in South Africa. And the town Johannesburg didn't exist before their gold rush. It's a true gold rush city, and it's the second largest city in South Africa today. So we started thinking, we should talk about gold rushes as a global event where people literally rush from different parts of the globe into British Columbia, whether they're Chinese miners from Peru or Chinese miners from Australia or Chinese miners from China. There's a lot of diversity and different levels of experience with all these people who are coming in. And of course, people are coming from Europe, and there was even a gold rush in the Maritimes, and people were coming around from there. And it's also something where in a gold rush, information and people move quickly. They don't move quickly like Twitter today, but as soon as the first ship arrives, the news arrives. And so the California gold fields were getting sort of close to played out by 1855. So news 3 years later about gold in British Columbia just triggered a massive movement. And the view by miners, quite rightly, is the first ones there get rich, and the third one there gets the pickings. So although it's slow by modern terms, information moved quickly and people moved quickly. When the 49 gold rush broke out and the news reached Fort Victoria in 1849, all of the staff in the Hudson's Bay Company's only sawmill quit and got on the first boat for California. And a lot of sailing ships lost crews. And because people just responded instantly, let's get down there and become wealthy. Now, information moving, it gave us some of our first colored graphics, which is kind of interesting, this poster from California, but it also began BC's history of publishing. So our first book is about the gold rush. And this Hibben and Carswell, who are doing printing for theater companies and for the government and things like that, 1862, they're selling out of their edition map of the gold regions of British Columbia. So the printed word begins here. Our first printing press is brought up for religious reasons, but it prints the first Francophone newspaper with an editor from Paris, and it's all the Nouvelle Calédonie is full of news of the gold fields. They do about 14 editions, and then the editor is killed when a ship's boiler explodes as the ship is sailing out of Victoria Harbor. So the speed for the 19th century is remarkably fast, and it brings overwhelming numbers of people. Another thing we explored in there is to look at scale of technology and the role of capital. So you can get, put on your Marxist hat and start analyzing the entrepreneur impacts. So what we have here in this picture is prospectors at work actually in California, but the principle is the same. And all you need to become engaged in a gold rush is you get yourself there. It would be good to have a shovel or something to pick at the rocks. And all you need is a pan, preferably blackened over a fire. Modern gold pans have little ridges to hold the dust, but early ones were just plain flat. So the cost of entry is pretty low, a tent, a bedroll, and a pan, and you're prospecting for gold. However, that's only the first wave. And in the first wave, most of the gold mining started along the Fraser, trying to get gold out of the gravel and then starting to work their way up the canyon through the sandbars. But pretty soon, the amount of investment that was required, like the Cameron claim up in the Caribou Goldfields, which is the general name for the area around Barkerville at the top of the Fraser. You can see a couple of things in this picture. The mine is underground. They've got sluices. You can see a big Cornish wheel to lift things up from below the surface. You can see all of the trees are gone. In part, they're gone because you need lumber. And some people realize they could get rich faster running a sawmill than worrying about panning gravel. But to get into this scale of mining means capital. Bankrolls by small groups of Victoria merchants who put together a company. And most of the people in this picture are being hired by the day to shovel gravel. They're not going to get rich. They're working in a gold mine, but it's not theirs. And also another reason for all of the trees gone is the risk of fire burning everything down. So if you go up to Barkerville today, the one thing that's not historically accurate is they let the forest grow back, which I'm very happy they did. But in the original time, it would be a lot of devastation environmentally. And here's Williams Creek, which is one of the famous creeks around Barkerville. And you can see, you know, what it looks like. There's a woman in the foreground. We don't know who she is. Looks like a Newfoundland dog or something. But you get an idea of what the gold rush does to the areas where these deep V-shaped valleys are. The valleys are formed really by glacial action. And then as the water is running down the bottom of the V, gold is heavier than anything else, and it tends to fall to the bottom. So the famous Billy Barker story is that he had a mine that nobody wanted, and he hit clay at the bottom. And he decided to keep going and punch through the clay. And at 40 feet down, he just found the whole V was filled with gold nuggets, which had dropped through the clay and from their own weight and gravity. And it made him rich. Billy Barker actually died in a retirement home here in Victoria, not far from the museum, penniless. Oops, we've seen that one. And a lot of people are hired to do these. These are the flumes to move the water to wash the gravel. And so there's a tremendous amount of capital involved, a lot of sawmills, a lot of investment, a lot of construction jobs. And that's a long way from that. And so who owns the gold in the gold fields starts changing very, very rapidly when you've got this scale of investment. One of the technical groups who did quite well in the gold fields were mechanics, which is what you used to call a millwright. Mechanics from Cornwall. Cornwall is where Rome had its tin mines. And so the Cornish had a 1,000-year history of being miners underground. They knew how to tunnel, they knew how to put up the shafts, and they also knew how to build these giant water wheels, which were originally a Roman technology. And so the Cornish miners would be paid, maybe not in cash, but in shares. And a lot of people worked on shares. Doctors received shares in mines when they treated a patient in Barkerville. They didn't necessarily get paid in gold nuggets or dust. And so everybody was in the entrepreneurial business. So this is the Davis claim with their water wheel. And here's a picture that even Bob Turner may not have seen. On the right is a guy called Jack Waters, and he is posing with the original museum water wheel, which he had built before the whole diorama was constructed. I got this picture from Michael Barnes, and I don't know where he found it, but I'd never seen it before. And if you look at the diorama, you'll also see how it was influenced a little bit by this photo on the left. These are not really big mine shafts. It's not like coal mines or Protection Island with the cage that takes you down. The cage is actually probably standing in that bucket. And when you get to the bottom, there's probably 2 or 3 feet of water and mud. And then you're shoveling that mud back into the bucket and they're taking it up. And you better hope that bucket doesn't fall and hit you in the head. This particular windlass is just adapted from ship technology and it's hand cranked. Or it could be powered by a power takeoff from one of the big water wheels. Yeah, no, okay. So you can see both elements of that past in the wheel that's constructed here in the permanent gallery. We had a lot of discussion about what to do with Jack's wheel, but it's been completely rebuilt twice already. So the view is we'll probably take all of this down, but then we'll recreate it in a new way. And you'll see the rope going up to the actual shaft that goes down. I think one of the big themes for the museum staff when they painted that diorama is that they were horrified at the environmental destruction, particularly to things like salmon habitat and also forests that the gold rush did to British Columbia. And so they brought that out quite strongly in the diorama. And then in the foreground are one of the favorite activities for young children, panning for gold. So learning staff would buy about a 1/4 ounce of fine gold dust a year and carefully sprinkle it into the gravel so that the kids would actually find some gold. It cost them in those days, the last time I heard a price, something like $300 in the annual budget to seed the gravel. And what the kids didn't know is behind the scenes was a technician who would check the water levels and put in enough chlorine so that there wasn't a bacteriological risk in that water as it flowed out for the school programs. But those kind of group activities literally came to an end with COVID. But so there's the link between the technologies. There's Billy Barker, and he does remain an icon, his story. But I think now a more realistic telling of the story is after he got his first fortune, he blew it and he tried again, but he never did find the gold that he found the first time. And he died, penniless in, I believe it was what's known as Rose Manor, not far from the Empress in the museum. So some of the stories that we told about the gold rush change, and some of them remain. Overall, through the years, we've done a fairly good job, although it's getting better and better every year, in telling the story of Chinese miners. These miners are not in the original gold rush, but they're not far behind it. Aho came up, and I think this is in the interior, more in the Kootenay gold rush, which is a later gold rush. There's a picture of him, age 63. He came for the gold and he stayed. And like many people, the bulk of people in the gold rush came, got broke, and went home. Or they went to the next gold rush in hopes that things would be better there. But a number of people became regional icons, and they stayed with it. They enjoyed it. They got along well with the isolation. They liked the wilderness and the outdoors that they were in. They liked the activity, and they're very much part of the community. And this is an Omanika miner, also 1871. Oh, no, both images, possibly the same man. But in that archival picture, they don't have a name, but in this one, they do. Oh, isn't that interesting? Same guy. So there he is in his shack, and there he is with his dogs. And the gold rush creates communities of merchants. And the merchants are the gatekeepers of wealth. They're the ones who give you credit, outfit you, send you on your way, send your money back home to your families, work with the local associations to make sure your body is returned or you get a proper burial, and all of these kinds of things. And some of those merchants are Chinese, but a large number of merchants are Jewish. And we've done a fairly good job learning about the Jewish merchant community, which is a really interesting group. But one of my favorites are the African-American community that came up here. Generally speaking, everybody in the photo was a free African-American. They came from California, and we've been digging into the American newspapers. And the California gold fields became whiter and whiter as time went on. If you were a Black shopkeeper, you couldn't necessarily depend on receiving justice in the courts. You weren't necessarily allowed to vote. If somebody came in on a racist tantrum and smashed up your store, tough. You were on your own. If you had a claim, you might be forced out. So the small free Black community of California was in somewhat of a crisis. California was arguing back and forth about what to do about slavery. And the Dred, was it Dred Scott, or have I got that mixed up with an American case? There was a man from the southern states who came with his slave, a young boy, into California, but California announced that he was free. And then he said, no, he's my property. And cases were going through the courts in California, and the Black community rallied around him, smuggled him onto a ship and sent him to Fort Victoria. Where he stayed for about 8 years until things were more normalized in California and it was safe for him to go back. So British Columbia, Vancouver's Island and Fort Victoria were seen somewhat as a haven. And things reached a crisis in California, and the community had a meeting of 600 people to discuss leaving California. And the question was where to go. There was an offer of a place in Guatemala. There was an offer of a place from a general in Mexico. And the other one was Vancouver's Island. And what some genealogy work has found out is that Governor James Douglas had an African aunt in British Guiana. The family originally was in the sugar trade. And he offered them literally equal citizenship if they came here. And so 650 African Americans with their families and kids came up here in 1858 for the gold rush. The dads went to the Fraser River to pan for gold. The mothers were taking care of the kids. Some of them set up shops. A census of them shows that most of them were small business keepers. There were one or two politicians who were very good and went on to careers and wrote memoirs. And they tried to integrate into the community. They were integrated in some of the churches, like the Anglican Church, and they tried to join the fire department, which was a volunteer fire department. And the volunteer fire department wouldn't allow them in for reasons of race. And they started finding racial tension. And on their own, they decided to set up the Victoria Pioneer Rifles as an honor guard for the governor who had invited them up. And so they said, fine, if we're not allowed in your organization, we'll create our own. And here's one of two photos I know of the Victoria Pioneer Rifle Corps. They had a drill hall, and the community as a group did not celebrate Abraham Lincoln's proclamation, although that was important to them. What they did celebrate was Emancipation Day in 1832, when slavery was outlawed in the British Caribbean. And they would have an Emancipation Day picnic out in Gordon Head with a dance and so forth. And that became the standard Canadian celebration of Black identity. Emancipation Day parades were still held in Vancouver and Toronto in the 1900s. Yeah. It didn't end well, though, because at the end of the Civil War, Britain had supported the Confederates, and a number of Confederates who came up on the tail end of the gold rush were on the run for war crimes, such as Quantrill's raiders, which burned down villages during the war and killed everybody in the villages. So there were bars with names like the American Bar, the Dixie Bar, and there were pro-Southern American immigrant theater owners, and they didn't want to integrate their theaters. There was a riot that broke out involving baseball bats and about 60 people. And the judge, who was trying to ensure peaceful order, found for the theater owner, not for the Black community. So at that point, they had come thinking that this was a superior racial society for them, where they would be more equal. And they started going, well, this isn't working, we're going home. Not all of them went home. Some of them farmed on Salt Spring and in Saanich, built churches, cemeteries, joined the school board and so forth. But a lot of people just went, well, the war is over and things have changed. I'm going to see what it's like back at what was, for them, home as well. So some made a home in BC and some did not. Looking at the lives of women in the gold rush, we're scratching our heads, because other than the wives of fur trade and colonial officials, we're still sort of looking at the hurdy-gurdy dancing girls who are not sex trade workers, but entertained in the bars and the canteens. And there were sex trade workers, but we're looking at a society that's, other than indigenous women, is about 95% European male or Asian male. So gender balancing the gold rush story is a problem for us. So you're constantly looking for the diary that really gives the experience of women in the gold rush. And here's something from the gold rush era. This is a wedding canopy from the synagogue in Victoria, presented by the Hebrew Ladies of Victoria, March 21st, 1864. It's a chuppah. And the couple who are getting married are standing under this with 4 posts holding it. And this is where they take their vows and crush the glass and are witnessed by the community. This one is very delicate, made of silk, was imported from London. And while you see lots of photos of primitive society of the gold rush, these people had money and they could bring in things. I was shocked at how rapidly you had a choice of 8 types of champagne in Victoria from the local merchants, for example. But the Jewish community is really interesting because it also goes against other stereotypes. In the middle of this case, you see a sign that says Henry Nathan Jr. and Company, General Commission Merchants. Henry was elected the first member from Victoria when we joined Confederation. And he was the first person to take a seat in Canada's Parliament using his religion as the oath. Not the traditional Bible, but taking his oath based on his religion. And Henry was a good friend of Dr. Helmicken, and he was part of the people who were doing the first attempt to build a railway through the Rockies, which fell apart. And basically, John A. Macdonald was publicly found out with a suitcase of money and driven from office. So Henry's sign would hang on his shop on Wharf Street, and commission merchants would bring in shiploads of goods, set them out on the floor, and have auctions, and smaller storekeepers would then bid on various items. And so when you look at the records of the Masons in Victoria, you'll find about 40% of the first membership are actually Jewish merchants. There weren't that many merchants, and they were welcomed into the Masonic Lodge. And the Masons helped them build the synagogue, which is the oldest synagogue in Western Canada, Temple Emmanuel, which is the same name and same division, because in any religion, there's variations of how things are interpreted. And there was a Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. So a number of these merchants came up to work for their family's firm and opened offices in British Columbia and stayed, moving goods up into the gold fields or becoming the mayor of Vancouver in one case. And we're very highly respected members of the community. And the Gold Rush brought the Barkerville Dramatic Society. I just love this picture. It's not really a good reason to put it in, but anyway. The thing that's happening here is amateur acting. Goldfields instantly bring circuses and professional theater companies and people to sing in the bar and all, on a world tour and all of that sort of thing. But it's the origins of BC's own theater. And from it comes the first plays written here. And you start to see the emergence of new communities coming out of these operations. This is Mosquito Creek. R. Carroll is in there. He's a doctor who, a lot of people don't know that Canadian doctors signed contracts to be doctors in the Civil War for the Union Army. And after the war, he went to San Francisco and heard about a gold rush up here and came and opened a practice in Barkerville, got paid in shares and became fairly well established. He organized the first Dominion Day or Canada Day celebrations in Barkerville in 1867, 4 years before we joined Canada. So he was definitely part of the Let's Join Canada party. His father knew John A. Macdonald. And a really interesting sort of sense of semi-permanence starts happening. Towns start to grow as transits. So the old story of the Royal Engineers and building the road up to the goldfields, which today is the highway that you take up to the goldfields if they're not closed by floods or fire, all of that happened, and it seeded small communities all along the route. And within that, there's diversity again, Hotel de France. So depending on where you came, would you like a hotel where you could be served in French? You went to the Hotel de France. And next to it is the express office. There was a real battle between who would control the stagecoaches, and stagecoaches in BC went north and south, not west. And the Barnard Express went to the goldfields. And they were in competition with Wells Fargo of San Francisco. So who would control the movement of gold and the movement of goods and people? And the BX Express, as it became known, became BC's first transportation system. And one of the members of the family became a lieutenant governor of British Columbia. And towns like Lytton are created. And there you have the wildfire story of this summer and destruction, sadly. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but if you want to learn more, there's two things you could have a look at. Catherine Bridge was our editor, and we all contributed chapters. You can read a chapter by me on Carroll and Confederation, one on the Chinese community from my colleague, Dr. Zui Chun, and a chapter from Dan Marshall on the Canyon War. So that's available from the museum, but I would also recommend Daniel Marshall's PhD thesis and his arguments about claiming the land, British Columbia, and the making of a new El Dorado, which maps out a lot of the conflicts engaged in the Canyon War. And I believe he's working on a film on that. The picture at the front, that's a Hind painting, which is in our collections, in the BC archives. And of course, the Goldfield brought artists and painters to illustrate it. And so there's a wealth of wonderful visual illustrations from the gold rush. So that's a little bit about what we learned about the Goldfield and what the sort of stories we'd like to talk about in a reimagining and re-envisioning of a new gallery. But again, we're going to take a lot of input from the community and discuss it, and it's going to evolve. But what we really learned from doing that exhibit is that there are stories that should be told and need to be told more fully. And we're kind of a little scrunched up for space and time. And always when you want to make changes in exhibits, there's the problem of money and budget. And for once, it appears we have a government that's prepared to put money on the table to make change. And so nobody likes change, but on the other hand, it's part of life too. And no exhibit is forever. The feeling in-house is, I was told this when I started. I asked, what do we do about the galleries? I was talking to Dr. Griffin, who knows far more about the gold rush and mining than I do. And he said, look, no gallery is permanent. Everything can go as long as what you build next is better. And I'm really comfortable with the young staff being able to achieve that. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I haven't looked in the chat, so I'll have a look right now. And I'll turn you back over to your host and turn my sharing off. I think, how do I do that? I don't know.
Thanks, Lorne. A couple of notes in the chat. Emily, I think, must have posted it. She's got a link there to the Times columnist, the letter to the editor that you were talking about. So,
oh, good.
If he wants to read it, there's a link there. And Peter asks, what was the value of the original chest of gold? I think that's the one referred to that went to San Francisco.
Don't know off the top of my head. One of the stories I didn't talk about, though, that is that in 1862, we founded our own mint. It was in New Westminster, and you had to bring your own gold, and they would strike a $20 or a $10 coin for you after they melted it and poured it into the dies. And one of the interesting things is we have those dies, and we have a set of all of those coins. There is a $20 coin, of which there are only 5 known examples. So they're extremely valuable. I think we had them appraised as a set once at $1.2 million. I believe the Royal Archives have a set and the British Museums have a set. We have a set. One set is in private hands, a numismatic collector, and I know the person who sold it to the person who bought it. And the last known example was offered for sale in Amsterdam in 1935 and withdrawn because nobody would pay the price. And then 1939, on the eve of the Nazis, it was sold. And what's really interesting is it was never seen again. And anybody who had it knows what the value is. And anyone who's a coin collector would certainly want to show off and boast that they have it. So it disappears into, the firestorm of World War II. It has never been seen since. As we took our coins and our gold off exhibit very carefully to put them in a vault, because what's behind me now is a construction zone. We have a new machine, and Gigi from Conservation is an expert with it. It's an XRF machine. It takes only about 5-8 seconds to do a reading. We started analyzing all our gold ores and all our gold coins to find out what they were. And we found that the $20 coins that were struck in 1862, and this is long before the Royal Mint of Canada even existed. Canada doesn't make gold coins until the Yukon Gold Rush around 1910 or something. This is 1862. Was 85% gold, and the bulk of the rest of it was silver and a few trace minerals. And so we can now analyze all coins and tell you everything that's in it, or we can analyze all the ores that came out of mines in 1937 and tell you it was 1% titanium, and really interesting things. One of the coins we got from the Royal Canadian Mint was the only thing that tested 100% silver. And another one from 5 years later in a different denomination had 2% zinc in it. Don't know why. Sometimes you add this so that the engraving is sharper. I don't, So sorry, I can't give you a number for the chest. I think it exists in correspondence, but it's not something I have easily at hand.
And Lorne, what was the population of British Columbia at the beginning of the gold rush? Like, how many settlers were there, and what in total, including the Indigenous people, what was the population? I'm trying to get at what was the impact of all those people coming into the province.
It's a very political question in terms of interpretation. I once saw an anthropology article that presented 40 different ways of calculating what the pre-contact Indigenous population was of North America. And they had literally 40 different formulas, etc. There's different ways of approaching it, carrying capacity on the land, censuses, and so forth. But before the word of gold got out, you're looking at about 1,500 Europeans. And you're looking at least 85 to 100,000 First Nations. It's hard to say because 1864 brings smallpox. And then there's decimation of 80, 90% or more in one specific village. The old way of looking at it was the death rate was the equivalent of Black Death. It was a third to 2/3 of the population of indigenous people. There's a book out there that argues it was a conspiracy to do germ warfare to wipe out indigenous opposition to the gold rush and so forth. I don't really believe that person's approach, because if you take it as at face value, it means that the Francophone community and their physicians, the Jewish community, the Royal Navy, newspaper editors who we know used to punch each other in the nose in the street over politics, and all of them, and the hospitals, all got together, covered it up, and had the capabilities of doing germ warfare on a mass scale. We do know that smallpox blankets were disseminated from a hospital in one fort in the United States by British troops in the 1700s, and that's well documented. But we also know that in the 1840s, the Hudson's Bay Company were given inoculation kits for smallpox and sent them up the Fraser Canyon, but the post journals where those kits went haven't survived. So we don't know what happened on the grassroots. We have a number of diaries of people who went up to the gold fields and took dried scabs, really, with them in their wallet and used them to do blood-on-blood inoculation against smallpox for indigenous people. So we know of one particular event. And the person, do you believe the person who became a minister, became a bishop in England afterwards, said he ran in at the ferry because there weren't bridges in most places, so you had to wait for the ferry. He ran into somebody a year later because he liked to walk, so he walked from New Westminster to Parkerville kind of regularly. He ran into somebody from the group he inoculated, and they told him that everybody he inoculated had survived, and the people who were away picking berries had died. They were not inoculated. But moving viruses around, it's so difficult. But related to that, one of the first pieces of legislation the colonial government did pass is the Native Graves Act, which made it an offense to take a blanket or a canoe or any objects from a First Nations cemetery. It made it a criminal offense. So you had miners stealing, canoes and so forth. And I certainly would not rule out angry American miners deliberately doing this, distributing blankets or figuring out a way of passing smallpox on at the micro scale. But you're talking about 30,000 people from a whole range of backgrounds, and a number of them who had come up through a very vicious American Indian War. And who knows what their attitude was. Well, we do know they shot all the Okanogans as soon as they met them, and the Okanogans had no firearms. The 30 people who were shot, and that was men, women, and children.
Okay, Kate raises a really interesting question. Were there female prospectors? Any idea if there were, and if so, how many? Don't really know. One of our learning team was exploring this. There are novels about if you want to get to the gold fields safely, dressing as a man is a way to do it. If you're a gay woman, why not? Especially if it's going to create wealth. On the other hand, there are the miners are paying in gold dust in the bars and the saloons. So where's the best place to raise money in the gold fields? It's probably serving the miners in the saloons. But all we really have, we do have miner permits, and another piece of data we have, because that's how Jean Barman's husband traced a Basque packer called Cataline or Jean Co. You pay road tax. So if you're hauling goods, and there were a huge number of indigenous people
African-American, Chinese, and Basques. Most of our early ranchers were Spanish background from California who came up with their mules and their saddles to move goods. So we can trace them, but all you have is a name on a government record, whether it's for a gold permit. So there has to be, you have to be able to get gender information out of a signature.
Thank you. And what year were the gold rushes over in BC?
They were and weren't over. 1864, everybody left. California was writing nasty editorials about what a bust British Columbia was. But from Barkerville, you got squeezed out by the big capital, the flumes behind me, things like that. But there were a whole series of gold rushes that carried on every 5 or 10 years. There was one on Vancouver Island at Leechtown in the 1860s. Another one was out in the Kootenays. And so you followed the trail along the south border out into the Kootenays. There was one further up with the Omanika. There was one in the 1890s in Atlan. Then there was the Yukon Gold Rush. The gold rushes have never stopped. In the Great Depression, Zabalas was one of 2 places in BC that were filled with float planes, which was a totally new technology because of gold. The other one was, Jack of Spades Lake at Barkerville, because the float planes allowed prospectors and geologists to fly from the center out to all these places and explore and see what they could find. So gold's continued. There's gold being mined today. There's the Pooley mine where the tailings, we told the story of the Pooley mine where the tailings broke and polluted all the salmon rivers downstream as an example of mining gone wrong in the times in which we live. So I believe you can still get, I think you can still get a free miner's permit and go to the Nanaimo River with your pan and start looking.
Okay, I think that's it for questions from the chat, but maybe there's some in-person live questions.
I think I have a question.
Okay, Margaret's got a question. Margaret Horsfield.
Hi, Lorne. You mentioned that you're waiting. Of course, one's always waiting to find diaries that have not been revealed yet. And you mentioned this in connection to women, possibly in Barkerville, possibly somewhere else. Realistically, because I did a little bit of work and was always hoping for another diary to surface that I never did, preferably by a woman. Realistically, what do you think the chances are? Are there still attics out there with undiscovered diaries? Are there still small local museums that haven't properly cataloged their stuff? You would know more than I about what the chances of that are now.
Well, for our gold exhibit, Dr. Chung borrowed materials from several small BC community museums, and it included a Chinese Masonic orders book giving all the rules and so forth. And those organizations help Chinese miners on their way up to the gold fields. So we didn't have that book. We'd never seen it before. So there is material in the small archives. And it also leads me around to one of the things I started with, which is it's a global event. So who left here and kept a diary and went somewhere else? Is there a diary that comments on what happened here in New South Wales or in South Africa? I've been looking for William Eddy Bamfield's diary because I know it was given to a relative in the 1870s who came up from Australia, but I don't know whether the diary survived or where that relative went. But I'd obviously love to see that and to read it. The other thing that's happening that's kind of new is newspapers are being digitized. And so for the Black community, we got to read newly digitized California newspapers that had stories about up here. And Dan Marshall's book and his PhD was really important because he was making use of materials in American archives that referred to British Columbia. And no one has really started looking for, a lot of people came from, say, Ontario. They haven't gone through Ontario small museums looking for correspondence from, letter from my nephew in Barkerville about what's going on and so forth. So we don't really know a lot about it. One of the other records that is currently only seen through the lens of residential school are religious records, because those organizations were also engaged in all of these other events and communities. Is there information in there on what they saw in their community? I don't know.
Little I know of the diaries of the priests on the west coast of Vancouver Island, they all had claims.
They all had?
They had mining claims.
The
priests.
Really?
Yes.
Priests?
Yeah.
Well, that's, like there's new knowledge right there.
And of course, the one thing about those guys is they kept very good records, as a rule. I mean, the diaries were invaluable to me anyway. But another quick point about your digitizing of American newspapers or any newspaper, I was very surprised to find Minnesota newspapers with headlines in 1906 about the gold to be discovered on Vancouver Island on the front page, 1906.
Oh yeah, it was global news.
Yeah,
you see, once the news gets to San Francisco, the Telegraph takes it all the way to New York and Boston.
But I was just surprised by it was in 1906, because you'd have thought it would have. What particular gold rush were they talking about? I don't know. Was that Leechtown? Yeah.
No, Leechtown is much, much earlier. One of the slides. I had a nice slide with all the dates, and then PowerPoint ate it. And I thought, I've only got 20 minutes. I haven't got time to rebuild that one. Yeah.
Okay, Rick's got a question about the miners. When they were underground, were they actively looking for silver as well as gold?
They're usually found together. So in all the gold we've been analyzing, in the gold ores, some of them came from places like Ceballos, and some came from the interior and so forth. But we're finding a lot of the gold ore. This is readings we literally only did in the last 2 weeks because we were taking things apart. And I said, well, before we put it away, why don't we use this new machine, and I'll just put that information in the record for the item. A lot of our gold ore was 80% gold, 20% silver. There was also something called ruthium and rhodium, sometimes a little bit of platinum, sometimes some titanium, often a bit of iron. And it varied with every mine. And when we were doing the readings, it was a really big chunk of ore. We'd take readings in more than one spot to just see if it's averaging out pretty close, and it usually was fairly close. So for example, I know in Trail, the smelter in Trail, which got its ore from 2 or 3 places, but including Kimberley, they were mostly smelting for lead, and they were producing copper and zinc. Those were sort of like their business minerals that were going out by the railway car. But they made their money on the silver that was found with it. And it was found with it in small amounts, like 4% or something like that. But in your smelting process, if you're very careful with it, you can separate them all out. So, there's your gravy, if you will, is in the accompanying minerals. The odd thing is that while the machine is set up for the periodic table, it won't tell me how much quartz is in that lump. And there's a lot of quartz in these lumps, so.
And Lorne, can you tell us the lock combination for the vault where the gold is stored at the museum?
No. We don't actually have that. We have 24/7 monitoring. And if you're not on the list and that door opens, there's an immediate response. One of the pictures I didn't show you was when we did the gold exhibit. I got to get in touch with the Bank of Canada, and I borrowed their collection of early gold coins, and then we put out our BC gold coins. So that was fun. And then I borrowed a trade ingot of gold, and this is something that weighs the equivalent of sort of 22 pounds of gold in a giant chunk. These are not gold for investors or jewelers. It's when banks exchange blocks of gold, they use these giant ingots, which are the ones you see them always trying to steal in Hollywood movies. But most Mini Coopers, if you filled it up with that, their suspension would break in reality. But I did borrow a 100-kilo gold coin that was 99% pure to 5 decimal places. And it arrived in an armored car, you know, armed guards and so forth. And then we had to figure out how to get it out of, not me, my exhibit team and my security team got it out and put it upright, and put it in the case and sealed the high security case. What makes that coin really interesting is the value of gold had gone up. And although it says $1 million on it as its face value, and it weighs 100 kilos, by the time we got it, it was worth $6 million. And they only made about 12 of them. One of them is a coffee table in one of the Middle Eastern states. They just put the coin sideways and put some glass on top, and there's your coffee table. I don't have such a coffee table. But another one was in a museum in Germany, and it made the news after ours because it was stolen in an inside job. And the people who stole it didn't realize that it was so pure that even if you chopped it into little chunks and tried to sell it, the purity would give it away and tell people that it was stolen and where from. So the chemical analysis of, I find this XRFing coins and ore really interesting because it means good luck if you're going to forge an antique coin, because we'll be able to know what the mix of metals was in a Greek or Roman gold coin or a rare American coin. And we certainly now know what the mix of minerals are in the coins that were struck in BC in 1862, and no one's known that before. And so it's kind of interesting, but some of my favorite things were the things that look like they're made out of gold and everybody thinks they're gold, but they're not. So I got to borrow an Oscar, Grammys from David Foster, but the Oscar came from a delightful man on Salt Spring who won it for set design for the film Abraham Lincoln. And he just sort of drove up in a pickup truck and handed it to me. Yeah, it was lovely. He uses it for fundraising for his local community art gallery. Would you like your picture taken? Holding it, you have to donate $5 to the community art gallery. And all of that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I tried to borrow a gold Les Paul from Brian Adams, and he was kind enough. Well, he told me that he had one, but he had given it as a Christmas present to his favorite guitarist from his band. And then the insurance company for that guitarist wouldn't allow it to leave the house because they're so rare and valuable. But the same guitarist designed a gold guitar for Gretsch, and he sent us up his gold guitar so we could have a gold guitar, Olympic medals and Commonwealth Game medals and Grammys and Oscars and all of that. So, I mean, we continue to think gold is something, is a standard of achievement, even if what's being given isn't necessarily actually gold, but it looks like it. The original designer of the Oscar told the metallurgist that he wanted it to weigh as much as gold, so that when it's given to the actors, they go, oh, it's really heavy. and so that they'll respond to that. So it's actually kind of made out of lead and a number of other amalgam metals, and then it's gold plated. So things that never made it into the exhibit. I tried to get the gold film that's used on one of the moon landing helmets. They just sent me a polite no, because the gold is used for reflection of radiation in outer space. And Elvis's gold lame suit, no, etc. But it was, what's fun about this job is you get to brainstorm and go, where will we let this story take us? And usually, almost all of our stories are focused on BC, but ideas and concepts and things that are in culture are fair game, really.
Kate asks, do you have a favorite specific time in BC history? That's a dangerous question to ask Kate because he might go on forever.
Oh boy, well, no, not really. It's, well, okay, if 1947 to 49, maybe.
Okay. Why?
Because when I was in university, W.A.C. Bennett and the social credits were like, oh, boo, hiss, hooray for the NDP and all of that sort of stuff. And, you know, they were old and they were seen as equated with corruption or something by my generation, generally speaking, sort of. And I don't speak for my entire generation. There are lots of people who totally disagree with me. But what's forgotten is that W.A.C. Bennett, when he came to power, represented a social revolution. Before that, BC society was controlled by the Anglo-Scottish elites of Vancouver and Victoria. And they were pretty much the government and so forth. But what brought him to power was small town BC. You know, everything goes to Victoria, everything goes to Vancouver. We don't even have paved roads here. And the people who came with him were all post-war immigrants. They, you know, if you're not Anglican, English, Scottish, then as a Hungarian or Dutch or German immigrant or Swiss and so forth, it was the first time that a lot of those people suddenly were MLAs and had a voice in government. And it's not that I'm a fan of W.A.C. Bennett, but I like these moments that are social revolutions where the old order is overthrown by voices that hadn't been heard before. We're living in one of those moments right now. You know, it's very clear to me that we're living in one of those moments. And when Dave Barrett was elected, that was another one of those moments. The number of things that were achieved by Dave Barrett and the NDP in that brief first term in office were amazing. And, you know, it was young professionals and social welfare reforms, the new professionals, more respect for teachers, you know, all of those kinds of things. So I'm kind of drawn to those moments when there's dramatic change. The gold rush is a dramatic change. World War I is a dramatic change. It's hard to get a good grip on the Depression because a lot of the records of what happened in the communities are still sealed. You know, like many municipalities have records of what happened to impoverished families, you know, in their municipal archives, but those aren't opened, and our national census isn't opened in the 30s yet.
Lorne, we should stop there.
Yeah.
Because I know that 3 or 4 people that are attending have a fitness class at 2:30.
Excellent.
So people are going to have to.
Liz, don't sign me up.
Okay, but thank you. Rick, do you want to say anything?
I do, yes. Thank you, Lorne. I could see how your dinner conversation could go on for quite some time. That's super interesting, and I think it's kind of got everybody encouraged to visit the new exhibit once it's all put together there. So we certainly appreciate your time and your affiliation with Protection Island. I'm sure you're going to be back, and please try and make your presence known when you're here. I'm sure a lot of people have a few questions for you as well. So
I was there Friday night for my birthday.
Oh.
But we had to come back the next day. We've got some responsibilities down here.
Yeah, I see. So just
I love the herons. At the ferry, we saw 4 going out and 6 coming back, just on the trees there at the bank.
Yeah. So just for everybody's knowledge, this is a little off the topic, but sort of on the topic. We've been, as the Lions Group, we've been having a few discussions regarding the opening or reopening of Beacon House and what that's going to look like. And so I think we're going to dip our toes in the water here a little bit and get things going. And Peter's going to reach out to historic users of the hall and kind of start laying out some groundwork, you know, combined with the city to see what we can do. And it does have a bit of a bent on the speaker series, because we're hoping that the 2 speakers in February either could speak in person at the hall with a small audience. The rest would have to be by Zoom. And we're going to try and make that happen. Of course, it's going to be small, so we're going to have to figure out how we're going to invite people to control the number of people. But also, we have two presentations in March. One is from the library and one is from the museum. The museum is going to talk about the history of Protection Island, and Kate and her group are going to talk about all the authors and the history around books and culture on the island as well. So we thought that we would gear those 2 talks to an audience of people who are new to the island. It's going to give them an introduction to things that they've been probably waiting for a long time. Some people have been here for a couple of years through COVID and not really met too many people. So it'll just give them an opportunity to start meeting people, and talking about having some kind of a reopening, bigger scale thing once the weather warms up a little bit too. So so if you get a call from Peter for your group or organization, you know that we're making progress, and we'll make sure that we're doing things as far as health orders and our responsibilities to our landlord, the city, as well. But it's going to add another dimension to things, I think, on the island here. So I'll let you know that. Emily, you have anything else you want to talk about? Are you still there, even? Hidden in behind your...
Can we give a round of applause like last time?
Sure.
Yeah, let's try that. Let's
unmute
everybody this time, Emily.
Oh, I don't do that.
Or maybe everybody has to unmute themselves.
They have to unmute themselves. Thank you.
Okay, so everybody
Thanks,
unmute
Lorne.
themselves. Thank you.
Excellent. Happy birthday.